G'day, it's Jamie, and welcome to Where's My Yowie. Today, I'm reading an old newspaper article about a Bunyip story set near Armidale in 1896, so we'll get into it. This was published in Sydney's Evening News on Saturday, the 15th of February, 1896, titled The Nidderthing by P.E. Quinn. The Nidderthing? What's that? Johnston shrugged his broad shoulders, and across his massive face passed an expression of trouble. O'Reilly regarded him curiously. Johnston was as strong as three men, and when his mind was made up, his will set like the locked jaws of a crocodile. Not a man to be shaken easily, but when his companion made the inquiry, he was visibly unnerved. Johnston was a surveyor, so was O'Reilly, but, like a majority of the members of the profession of recent years, there had been no employment for them, and now they were mining engineer and manager respectively at Kalgoorlie. The day's work was over, and they were talking leisurely in their tent. Johnston had remarked of a Hebrew shark with an enormously fat but strangely white and misshapen face, who had been prowling around the field for the previous week, that he reminded him of the Nidderthing. He looked at O'Reilly, who was obviously waiting for an answer. Johnston then stared moodily before him, evidently debating the reply. "Look here, O'Reilly," he said, "I'll tell you what I never told before a living man. You know me too well to class me as a madman, but what I am going to relate as a personal adventure would be sufficient evidence of mental rottenness were it spoken to a stranger." O'Reilly said nothing, but wore an expression of intense interest. He had an instinct that his feelings were about to be harrowed in some way, and he had all an Irishman's tender of fondness for the uncanny. "9 years ago," said Johnston, "I was engaged to survey a pastoral holding in New England, the eastern end of which was a mass of broken country about the head of the Gura River. It was a rough place, cut about by awful gullies, lined with precipitous walls. You know the kind of place." O'Reilly gave him a grimace of understanding. "There were three of us, Bert, the best axeman I ever had, and Rogers, a chainman, who had been with me for a couple of years. They were both expert bushmen and knew what to do as well as I did. As a rule, we spelled over Sunday. One Sunday morning, Bert took the rifle and went down a deep gorge to try for a wallaby. He never came back. We had no misgivings about him till sunset, for anybody could tell, from a glance at the gully, that a descent right to the bottom might well take even an expert climber like Bert from 2 to 3 hours. We heard his rifle speaking twice during the morning, and then, as it was silent, we concluded that he had got round an elbow of a gully, probably on the track of a wounded wallaby. Towards night, however, we began to get uneasy. Rogers suggested that he might have slipped and sprained his ankle. We climbed down a little way and cooeed. There was no answer, but the taunting echoes of the ranges. It was useless to think of making a descent in the dark. That would spell to disaster, if not death, to one or both of us, so we turned in. At daybreak next morning, we began the descent. It was uncommonly rough travelling, and it was quite 2 hours before we reached the little creek at the bottom. The gorge was narrow, and only visited by the sun for a couple of hours at midday. Both the sides were full of rich semi-tropical vegetation, and the place was abandoned morning and afternoon to a kind of green twilight. But for the rushing stream, the stillness would have been like the silence of a crypt. We tracked Bert through the twisted vines for about 500 yards until we came to a rather spacious pool. On the bank there were the rifle and Bert's clothes. We looked into each other's eyes and shuddered at what we read there. "Poor Bert," Roger said sadly. "He's a goner." "He could swim like a fish," I remarked. "He must have got a cramp." "Very likely," sorrowfully asserted Rogers. There was nothing to do but to recover the body. It would be a weary task to transport it to the camp, but it had to be done. I stripped and prepared to plunge in. "You better mind, sir," urged Rogers warningly. "He might be snagged. I wouldn't dive in if I was you." I entered the water quietly, feeling with my feet as I waded towards the centre of the pool. Presently my foot touched something that gave me a queer sensation. I stooped and picked it up. Johnson looked solemnly at his friend. It was a human skull, bare of eyes, flesh and hair, but, for all that, horribly new-looking. With a sickening intuition, I knew at once that it was the relic of poor Bert. I passed it to Rogers, who stood white and awe-stricken on the bank, and then proceeded with the ghastly quest. We got all his bones, every one. The skeleton must have been lying intact on the floor of the pool. We sat down and smoked our pipes in silence, for my part trying to solve the mystery of the bones heaped before us. "What's done this?" at last Rogers inquired in a strange tone. "Crayfish, I suppose," was my suggestion. Rogers shook his head gloomily. "Eels, do you think?" I remarked. "There ain't enough eels or crayfish in the creek to skin a man's bones like that in a single night. I'll tell you what it is, sir. It's the Nidderthing." I looked at Rogers keenly. The experience might have shaken a stronger brain than his. "I've heard the Aborigines speak of it often," he said. "It's not exactly a bunyip. It's more of a man than a beast, and it lives on human flesh. I've known for 20-odd years that there's one gully the Aborigines would never go down for rum or money because the Nidderthing lives in the water holes there, and this must be the identical place." He gazed fearfully about the vault-like gorge, from which the light of the noon had long passed. There were glooms of the ending day were thickening. "I'm no coward, as you know, O'Reilly, but the evidence of the mysterious tragedy before me, the ghastliness of the surroundings, and the horrible still pool, and more than all, Roger's low convinced tones and livid face, impressed me with a uncanny sensation. "We'd better go before it's dark," I said, rousing myself. "Go," Rogers said wistfully. "We'll never go from here, sir." The despairing words struck me through my soul, like the strokes of a bell of doom. I looked at Rogers. He was in a state of collapse. It would never do to let him yield to his terrible fears. "Get up," I said sternly. "God help me," he replied, his eyes bulging from his white face. "I can't get up." I took him by the arm and shook him. He was like a bag of chaff. His backbone seemed to have melted, and my anger, I kicked him. "You coward," I said. "Do you call yourself a man?" He merely huddled himself together as if for warmth. There was nothing for it but to camp where we were till morning. I couldn't carry Rogers up the steep cliffs, and it was equally impossible to desert him in his state of collapse. I lit a fire and made some tea, which I had to force down Roger's throat. His frightened gaze seemed fascinated alternately by the treacherous pool and poor Bert's heaped bones, on which the firelight played fantastically. It was night in the gully, though I knew that there was warm daylight on the crest of the ridge, and I prepared myself a long and anxious vigil. Rogers wouldn't talk, and I had my own thoughts, so the hours passed till somewhere about midnight. I had been dozing when a cry from Rogers awoke me. "Great heavens!" I heard him scream. Then he began to cry like a child. A strange weakness came over me, just such a state of collapse as Rogers had been in earlier in the evening. I watched him in mysterious fascination as he arose and with unsteady steps staggered down to the edge of the pool. He waded slowly in, alternately cursing and crying bitterly, until the waters went over his head. When he came to this incident in his narrative, Johnston buried his haggard face in his hands, evidently overcome by the scene conjured up by his words. O'Reilly waited in breathless silence the resumption of the strange story. "For my life," continued Johnson, "I could move neither hand nor foot. I could only stare at the black water which had enshrouded my comrade's head, in certain expectation of an awful sequel. The moon, which was then directly overhead, suddenly broke through a cloud and fell on the pool, and in the clear light I saw Roger's legs project from the water, sticking up stiffly like a queer snag, and besides them else that set me vomiting violently." Johnston's voice grew husky. "It was a huge head, bald like a bladder of white lard, but the face, I wonder its hideous did not strike me dead or mad on the spot. Through its foul corruption, something that were like cunning eyes leered into mine, and through all my stricken frame I felt an overpowering desire to respond to that dread invitation. But before I could follow Rogers, the fell vision sank with its victim, and the untroubled surface of the pool laughed back at the moon. "Thanks be to the holy saints of heaven," ejaculated O'Reilly. "With the disappearance of the thing, my energies returned. I felt that only my safety lay in immediate flight, and in my frantic fear I scaled the gorge side in the dark and without mishap. When I reached the town, I looked like an old man, they said. The police were sent out to verify my story and reported that they had searched the gully, but could find no trace of the two men. I know that they never set foot in the accused gorge for fear of meeting the foul Denzian. There be strange things in the world," said Rogers thoughtfully. "The end. Well, I really like that story. And just remember, next time you're out in the bush and near a waterhole, stay away from it or the Nidderthing will get you. Okay, that's it from me. I'll get back to you all next time. Bye."